Hello, and this is going to be a brief introduction to Carl Gustav Jung and his typology. On a personal note, I have been fascinated with Jung for a couple years now. I got started by being interested in personality and better understanding people, so I started learning about Myers-Briggs, and the source material for Myers-Briggs just happens to be Carl Gustav Jung, and so by doing some reading, I found someone I found very interesting. Anyways, so it's Carl Jung, and that's Jung, not Jung or Young. He was a Swiss-born psychiatrist who was active from about 1910 to 1961. In this picture here, here's a young Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. They met in around 1910. When they first met, they spoke for 12 hours. Freud was already at the time a world-famous psychologist. And Freud's initial intention for Jung was for Jung to become his successor, but that fell through when Jung visited America to promote Freud's school of thought at a conference. But he just ended up deviating too far and promoting his own ideas, which he was just starting to develop at the time. Now, in modern times, Jung is often thought of as a Freudian, but his psychoanalytic theory, which he creatively called analytic psychology, is overwhelmingly extensive, and it stands up on its own. So he's famous for his theory of psychological types, also his theory of archetypes in the collective unconscious. Some of those archetypes would be the great mother, the great father, the wise old man, the wise old woman, the trickster, and there's a couple more. He also came up with a theory of individuation, and he wrote extensively on that. And the theory of individuation is a process of the development of personality. He also came up with art therapy, and that very much ties into individuation. He studied a lot of esoteric texts, and he discussed the role of synchronicity in the development of personality. Basically, meaningful coincidences seem to coincide with major changes to personality. Like many great and wonderful people, he is misquoted and misunderstood on the internet from time to time. Anyways, over the course of his life, he made some rather interesting paintings as a part of his art therapy. That's for another video. I don't think most people would really benefit from reading Jung. His books are aimed at a very particular audience. They're not very accessible. They're kind of obscure. If you ask someone to briefly explain what he's about, they might mention the archetypes or his take on dream interpretation. That's a very, very significant portion of his work, dream interpretation. Anyways, but where Jung's work is most valuable, it's also the most obscure. But he does do a good job of providing tools to explore one's inner self if you're willing to invest the time to learn a rather extensive theory. Anyways, but his value also lies in being able to describe the inner world of dreams, how to access creativity, feelings, and so on. And he uses an absurdly extensive knowledge of religious and mystic writings and also some philosophy. He did some of his own mystic writings called the 7 Sermons to the Dead, which is available online, and the Red Book, which is not for the faint of heart. Anyways, the vast majority of his work on typology comes from his book, Psychological Types. And which is not to be confused with his book, The Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious. The Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious. It's almost more based on literature. Anyways, so the first 300 pages of Psychological Types are their references and like to a really weird assortment of literary, philosophical, and religious texts, which he uses to lay a foundation and provide for his own personal understanding of personality types. A good example of this would be how Carl Gustav Jung references the American psychologist and philosopher William James. William James is famous for taking nitrous oxide, which is basically laughing gas, getting high off of it, and then he wrote about basically religious experiences on nitrous oxide. And so that's just kind of the person William James was, but still a rather notable psychologist and philosopher. Anyways, so William James predated Jung by a couple decades, and he came up with his own kind of typology. And it was a series of opposites that he himself had noticed a few decades prior to Jung. And some of those opposites are rationalism versus empiricism, intellectualism versus sensationalism, idealism versus materialism, optimism, pessimism, religiousness, And I think the idea behind it is, if you can sort people into types. Some people are more rigid and some people are more flexible. Some people are rule based, some people are objective based, and so on. So anyways, the important thing to take away from all of this is that there's a significant history of splitting people into yin and yang opposites. For Carl Jung, that was thinking and feeling, sensing and intuition, but most importantly, splitting them into extroverted and introverted. And more on that later. Carl Jung's take on introversion versus extroversion is a lot different than what most people have in mind. Usually when people think introverted, they think kind of quiet and shy. And Jung takes that in a completely different direction. And Jung is actually the source for ideas of introversion and extroversion, but it just seems to have kind of developed on its own separately. Anyways, so again, an important thing to take away from all of this is that it's not just Jung or Myers-Briggs that sorts people into groups of opposites. Anyways, the splitting is only so useful as it contributes to our ability to understand, know, and describe people by mapping juxtapositions that we observe onto language. So what this does is it provides us with a qualitative understanding of personality, which can be meaningful and useful. It can absolutely be a useful tool, but it shouldn't be confused for a more quantitative psychological measure like IQ, which is a lot more stable over time. It's less descriptive. It might be less personally meaningful, but it does a very solid IQ, that is, and quantitative measures. They're very solid and much more difficult to disprove, and there's a lot less debate. So certainly a lot of this is up for debate, but I still think it's absolutely useful. I'll definitely bring this up again in a future video. Anyways, so the difference between Carl Jung and Myers-Briggs, I think Jung highly stresses the importance of the role of the unconscious. In Myers-Briggs, I feel like there's a lot of different takes and people interpret it differently. But in Jung's theory, there's 8 types. You can be a thinker, a feeler, a sensor, or an intuitive person, and you might be introverted or extroverted. And yeah, and they're all pretty unique. And in future videos, I'm going to be going over each one separately. So the most important thing to take away from Jung's typology is the importance of the role of the unconscious. The role that the unconscious plays is foundational to Jungian psychology, depth psychology, psychoanalysis, or whatever you'd like to call it. But specifically in Jungian psychoanalysis, the unconscious acts as a compensating mechanism. If someone strays too far from themselves and their nature, the unconscious will seek to compensate, and it's usually not in a way that is beneficial to your own life, but it'll kind of maintain your well-being. It might. So for an example, if you're primarily a thinker, and let's say we have the example of an accountant. If an accountant, he's very dry, he doesn't pay attention to his feelings, and then all of a sudden one day, something in the unconscious has been building up, and he goes out, he buys a sports car, he has a midlife crisis, and so on. There's unmet needs that kind of blossom on their own, and if you're not paying attention to these underlying needs that are, just below the threshold of consciousness, hidden in symbols and dreams and so on, you're going to run into trouble, and you're not going to be prepared for it. So, and Jung called, like the example that I gave with the accountant, he called that enantiodromia, which is a change into opposites. Anyways, so in Jungian typology, you're encouraged to develop your inferior function, which is the exact opposite of your primary function. In one of the previous pictures, here we have thinking being opposed to feeling and sensing being opposed to intuition. And there's a reason for that. So if someone focuses and relies too much on thinking, feeling is going to, the feeling function is going to kind of build up in the unconscious. And ideally, you want to switch back and forth and use them. They work best hand in hand. I don't want to get too much into his typology right now. That's for a future video. I just wanted to give a brief introduction. And cheers. Thanks for listening.